The Wyoming sun was dying behind the ragged peaks of the Medicine Bow Mountains, painting the vast expanse of sagebrush and buffalo grass in shades of copper and blood. A harsh wind whipped across the valley, carrying with it the sting of alkali dust and the promise of another merciless night. In the distance, a lone wolf's howl pierced the gathering darkness, its mournful cry echoing off the canyon walls like a harbinger of sorrow. Clayton Ward stood on the porch of his sprawling ranch house, a whiskey glass forgotten in his weathered hand as he surveyed his domain. At 43, he was one of the wealthiest cattlemen in the territory, his herds numbering in the thousands, his land stretching farther than a man could ride in a day. Yet, as he watched the shadows lengthen across the dusty yard, a familiar emptiness gnawed at his gut, more persistent than any hunger he'd known during his lean years. Behind him, the soft rustle of silk announced his wife's presence before she spoke. "Supper's ready. Clayton." He didn't turn. Eleanor's voice, sweet as wild honey, had once stirred something in him. Now it only reminded him of the gulf between them, wide as the Laramie Plains. She was 24, 19 years his junior, with cornflower eyes and hair the color of prairie wheat. He'd married her 2 years ago, bringing her from her father's failing farm in Nebraska to this isolated kingdom of cattle and dust. "I'll be along," he said, his voice rough as the weathered fence posts that marked his boundaries. He heard her hesitate, could picture the way she'd be wringing her hands in that nervous habit of hers. "The biscuits will get cold," she ventured. "I said I'll be along." Her footsteps retreated, and he took another pull of whiskey, letting it burn down his throat. The truth was eating at him like a cancer. Did she love him? Or was it his fortune that had drawn her to accept his proposal? The question had been festering ever since he'd overheard her talking to Mrs. Hutchins at the general store last month, laughing about how she'd never have to worry about money again. That night, as Eleanor cleared the dishes in silence and the grandfather clock ticked away the hours, Clayton made his decision. He would test her. He would know, once and for all, whether her heart belonged to him or to his bank account. The plan came to him fully formed, as if whispered by the prairie wind itself. A riding accident during a sandstorm, common enough in these parts. His best horse, Tempest, was known for being skittish. The dried riverbed where flash floods carved new channels every spring would provide the perfect stage for his disappearance. Over the next week, Clayton made his preparations with the same methodical care he applied to breeding his prize bulls. He visited his lawyer in Cheyenne, ostensibly to update some contracts, but really to ensure Eleanor would be well provided for as his widow. He paid off his ranch hands' wages a month in advance, telling them he wanted to reward their loyalty. He even wrote a letter to his younger brother Thomas, who ran a small spread near the Colorado border. Though the words came hard, they'd barely spoken in 5 years. Not since their father's will had left Clayton the lion's share of the family holdings. The night he chose for his deception was perfect. A wall of dust rolling in from the west. The kind of storm that could swallow a man whole. Eleanor begged him not to ride out. "The cattle can wait until morning," she said, catching his sleeve as he reached for his oilcloth duster. "Please, Clayton, these storms are dangerous." For a moment, looking into her worried eyes, he almost relented. But then he remembered her laughter at the store, the way she'd said money like it was a prayer answered. "Storms don't wait for convenience," he said, shrugging her off. "Neither do wolves when they're after the calves." He saddled Tempest in the barn, the stallion dancing nervously as sand began to pelt the walls. His foreman, Jake Sullivan, appeared from the bunkhouse, squinting through the growing dust. "Boss, you sure about this? Can't see your hand in front of your face out there." "That's why I'm going alone," Clayton said, checking his rifle. "No sense risking more men than necessary. If I'm not back by dawn, check the north pasture." Jake nodded reluctantly. He was a good man, loyal as they came. Clayton felt a twinge of guilt for the deception, but pushed it down. This was necessary. He rode out into the howling darkness, the storm immediately swallowing him. Sand stung his face like 1,000 needles, and Tempest fought the bit, wanting to turn back to the safety of the barn. Clayton guided him toward Deadman's Wash, the dried riverbed that would serve as his stage. There, sheltered somewhat by an overhang of rock, he dismounted and set about creating his scene. He'd brought a leather pouch of cattle blood from yesterday's slaughter, and he splattered it liberally on the rocks and sand. He tore his shirt, leaving a piece caught on a sharp branch. His hat, the silver-banded Stetson Eleanor had given him last Christmas, he wedged between two boulders where flash flood debris typically collected. The hardest part was Tempest. The horse had been with him 8 years, had carried him through blizzards and Indian raids and cattle drives that would break lesser animals. But the plan required sacrifice. He removed the saddle and bridle, hiding them in a crevice he'd scouted days before, then fired his pistol into the air. Tempest, already spooked by the storm, bolted into the darkness. He'd find his way back to the ranch by morning, riderless and wild-eyed, completing the illusion. Clayton then began his long walk to the abandoned trapper's cabin he'd prepared. 5 miles through the storm. He'd stocked it with supplies to last a month, maybe 2. From there, he could watch the ranch through his field glasses, could see how his widow would mourn him. By the time he reached the cabin, the storm was beginning to die, and the first pale hints of dawn touched the eastern sky. He was exhausted, sand in every crease of his clothing, his feet blistered from the walk in riding boots. But he was also strangely exhilarated. The die was cast. He didn't have to wait long for the alarm to be raised. By full daylight, he could see through his field glasses the flurry of activity at the ranch, riders heading out in all directions, and there, Tempest being led into the barn, saddle gone, reins trailing. He watched Jake Sullivan mount up with 5 other men, heading toward Deadman's Wash. They found his blood and torn shirt quickly enough. By noon, most of the ranch hands were searching the wash and the surrounding area. Clayton watched Eleanor emerge from the house, still in her morning dress, Jake's hat in his hands as he delivered the news. Even from this distance, Clayton could see her sway, saw Jake catch her arm to steady her. The search continued for 3 days. They found his hat downstream, just where he'd placed it. The blood on the rocks, the torn shirt, the spooked horse. It all painted a clear picture. A man caught in a flash flood during a sandstorm. His body swept away to God knows where. It happened often enough in this unforgiving land. On the 4th day, they held a simple memorial in the ranch's small cemetery, where Clayton's parents lay beneath weathered headstones. The Baptist minister from town spoke about the wages of sin being death, but the gift of God being eternal life. His words nearly lost in the wind. Clayton watched through his field glasses as they lowered an empty coffin into the ground. Eleanor had insisted on it, though there was no body to bury. She stood at the graveside in a black dress he'd never seen before, her face hidden by a dark veil. The ranch hands stood in a respectful semicircle, hats in hand. Jake Sullivan kept a protective hand under Eleanor's elbow, and Clayton felt an unexpected stab of jealousy at the gesture. But it was the figure standing apart from the others that made Clayton's breath catch. Thomas, his younger brother, had come after all, despite the bad blood between them. He stood like a dark sentinel at the edge of the gathering, his face carved from stone, giving away nothing of his thoughts. Thomas had always been the difficult one, the brooding one, where Clayton had inherited their father's gift for business and command. Thomas had gotten their mother's sensitive soul and their grandfather's wild streak. He was 38 now, still unmarried, running his small ranch with a handful of Mexican vaqueros who were loyal to him alone. As the minister finished his prayers and the mourners began to disperse, Clayton watched Thomas approach Eleanor. His brother removed his hat, spoke a few words too quiet to carry on the wind. Eleanor raised her veil to respond, and even from this distance, Clayton could see her face was ravaged by grief, her eyes red and swollen. A savage satisfaction filled him. She mourned him truly. Then, perhaps he had been wrong about her. Perhaps, but no, it was too early to tell. Grief could be performed as easily as any other emotion. He would wait and watch. Time would reveal the truth of her heart. As the mourners filed back to the house for the traditional meal, Thomas lingered by the grave. He stood there a long time, staring down at the fresh-turned earth, his expression unreadable. Finally, he placed something on the headstone, Clayton couldn't see what, and walked away. That night, alone in his hidden cabin, Clayton Ward sat by the cold fireplace and wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. The wind howled outside, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. Somewhere in the darkness, a wolf howled, and its cry seemed to speak of all the loneliness in the world, but he'd come too far to turn back now. The test had begun, and he would see it through to the end, no matter the cost. In the morning, he would resume his vigil, watching and waiting to discover whether his wife's heart was true or whether she would betray him. He didn't yet know that betrayal could take many forms, or that the greatest treachery might be his own. The great house seemed to have doubled in size since Clayton's death, its rooms echoing with a loneliness that pressed against Eleanor from all sides. She moved through the days like a ghost herself, the black mourning dress hanging loose on her frame as appetite deserted her. At night, the wind moaned through the gaps in the wooden walls, a sound that had once been merely background to their life together, but now seemed to carry accusations. The ranch hands kept their distance, offering respectful nods when they saw her, but quickly averting their eyes. She knew what they thought, what the whole town thought. A young widow with a fortune was like blood in the water to sharks. Already. She'd heard the whispers when she'd ventured into town for supplies. Poor thing. Mrs. Hutchins had said to Mrs. Garrett at the general store, not bothering to lower her voice. Though I suppose she won't be poor for long. Pretty young woman like that, with all that Ward money. She'll have suitors lined up before the year is out. 6 months. Mrs. Garrett had corrected with the authority of a woman who knew about such things. That's the proper mourning period. Though, mark my words, some won't even wait that long. Eleanor had left without buying the flowers she'd come for, their words following her like buzzing flies. They didn't understand. How could they? They hadn't known the weight of Clayton's silences, the way he could fill a room with his presence while still being utterly unreachable. They hadn't loved him despite his remoteness, hadn't spent nights wondering if she could ever bridge the distance between them. Now that distance was infinite, and she was drowning in it. 2 weeks after the funeral, Thomas Ward appeared at her door. She'd been attempting to review the ranch ledgers. Jake Sullivan had been patient in explaining them, but the numbers swam before her eyes like meaningless insects. When she heard the knock, she assumed it was Jake with another question about the operations, but it was Thomas who stood on her porch, hat in hand, his dark eyes serious beneath brows that were so like Clayton's it made her heart stutter. Mrs. Ward, he said formally, I've come to see if you need assistance with the ranch affairs. She invited him in, acutely aware of her unkempt appearance. She'd forgotten to pin up her hair properly that morning, and it hung in loose waves around her shoulders. Thomas seemed to deliberately look past her as he entered, focusing on the ledgers spread across Clayton's massive oak desk. I can manage, she said, though they both knew it was a lie. Clayton was a complicated man, Thomas said, settling his large frame into the chair across from the desk. His business dealings were equally complex. There's no shame in needing help to understand them. Something in his tone, gentle where Clayton's would have been gruff, made her eyes burn with unshed tears. She blinked them back fiercely. Why are you here? She asked. You and Clayton hadn't spoken in years. A shadow crossed Thomas's face. My brother and I had our differences, but family is family, and your family now. Eleanor. The use of her given name was improper, too familiar, but she was too tired to correct him. Instead, she pushed the ledgers toward him. The numbers for the cattle sales don't match what Jake says we should have received. Thomas studied the books, his finger tracking down columns of figures. He had Clayton's hands, large, capable, scarred from years of hard work. But where Clayton's movements had been brusque and impatient, Thomas was deliberate, careful. Here, he said finally. Clayton was holding back part of the payment for the Army contracts. See this notation? He was waiting for beef prices to rise before completing the sale. Smart business, but it means you'll need to renegotiate with Fort Laramie directly. I couldn't possibly. I'll go with you, Thomas said simply. The commander knows me. We've done business before. And so began a pattern. Thomas would arrive every few days, always in daylight, always maintaining proper distance. He helped her understand Clayton's complex network of contracts and obligations. He showed her how to read the weather signs that determined when to move the herds. He taught her to recognize which ranch hands were trustworthy and which might take advantage of a widow's inexperience. The town, predictably, took notice. That Ward brother's been spending considerable time at the ranch. Mrs. Hutchins observed to anyone who would listen. Course, someone needs to help that poor girl. She hasn't the first idea about running a cattle operation. Seems improper to me. Mrs. Garrett added, a widow alone with her brother-in-law. What would Clayton think? Eleanor heard these whispers on her increasingly rare trips to town. They stung, but not as much as the loneliness that waited for her at home. Thomas's visits had become the only bright spots in her weeks, though she tried not to examine that fact too closely. One evening in late autumn, an early blizzard caught Thomas at the ranch. He'd been helping Jake and the hands bring the cattle down from the high pastures, racing against the storm. By the time they got the herd secured, the snow was falling too thick to risk the ride back to his own spread. You'll have to stay, Eleanor said, trying to keep her voice practical. I'll have Maria make up the guest room. But Maria, the Mexican cook who came in daily, had already left for town before the storm hit. Eleanor found herself alone in the house with Thomas for the first time, the wind howling around them like a living thing. She busied herself making coffee and warming the stew Maria had left. Thomas built up the fire in the main room, his movements efficient and quiet. When she brought him his supper, she found him staring into the flames, his expression distant. You miss him, she said softly. Thomas looked up, surprised. Is it that obvious? You get the same look he used to have, like you're seeing something far away. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Clayton and I were close once, when we were boys. Before. He trailed off. Before what? Before I fell in love with the wrong woman. His voice was bitter. The woman he'd chosen for himself. Eleanor's breath caught. She'd never heard this story. Thomas continued, still staring at the fire. Her name was Catherine, daughter of a railroad man. Beautiful. Spirited. Clayton had been courting her for months. Had it all planned out, how she'd be the perfect wife for a man of his ambitions. Then she met me at a church social, and he shrugged. Sometimes the heart doesn't follow plans. What happened? Clayton found out. Gave me a choice. Leave Wyoming or he'd ruin me. Make sure I couldn't buy so much as a handful of seed anywhere in the territory. Thomas's laugh was humorless. I was 25. Proud as sin. I stayed. And he was as good as his word. Took me 3 years to scrape together enough to start my own place. And by then Catherine had married a banker in Denver. Eleanor set down her coffee cup, her hands trembling slightly. That's why you haven't spoken all these years? Part of it. The rest was about our father's will. But yes, mostly it was about Clayton getting what Clayton wanted, no matter the cost. He looked at her then, his dark eyes intense. I shouldn't speak ill of him. Not to you. Not now. He wasn't a perfect man, Eleanor said carefully. I knew that when I married him. Why did you? The question seemed to surprise them both. Eleanor considered her answer. My father was dying. The farm was failing. Clayton offered security, respectability, and I thought... She paused, then continued more quietly. I thought I could make him happy, that maybe if I loved him enough, he'd soften, open up, but he never did. Clayton didn't know how to be soft, Thomas said. Our father beat that out of him early. They sat in companionable silence, listening to the storm rage outside. The firelight painted Thomas's face in warm tones, highlighting the strong line of his jaw, the premature silver at his temples. He was handsomer than Clayton in a quieter way. Eleanor realized, where Clayton had commanded attention, Thomas invited it. "I should check on the horses," Thomas said abruptly, rising. "In this storm, don't be foolish." But he was already pulling on his coat. She understood. He needed distance, just as she did. The room had grown too warm, too intimate. After he left, Eleanor sat alone by the dying fire, her thoughts in turmoil. She'd been lonely for so long, even before Clayton's death. Was it so wrong to find comfort in conversation, in the simple presence of another human being who seemed to understand? The storm lasted 2 days. Thomas slept in the barn despite her protests, only coming to the house for meals. They spoke of safe things, the ranch, the weather, the challenges of the coming winter. But underneath, something had shifted. An awareness that made their eyes meet and skitter away, that charged the air between them with unspoken possibilities. When the snow finally stopped and Thomas prepared to leave, Eleanor felt panic rise in her throat. The thought of returning to her empty routine, to the crushing silence of the house, was almost unbearable. "You'll come back?" she asked, hating how desperate she sounded. "To help with the ranch business?" Thomas paused in the doorway, his hat in his hands. "Eleanor," he said softly, and her name on his lips was like a caress. "I'll always come when you need me, but we must be careful. The town already talks." "Let them talk," she said fiercely. "You don't mean that. You're a respectable widow. Your reputation—" "My reputation won't keep me warm at night. Won't help me run this ranch. Won't—" She stopped, appalled at what she'd almost said. Thomas stepped closer, and for a moment she thought he might touch her. Then he seemed to catch himself, stepping back. "I'll come back in a few days. We'll go to Fort Laramie about those contracts." After he left, Eleanor stood at the window watching his horse disappear into the white landscape. The house settled around her with familiar creaks and groans. But now the loneliness felt different. Now it had a shape, a name, a pair of dark eyes that saw too much. She was in trouble, and she knew it. But as she turned back to the empty rooms of her widowhood, she couldn't bring herself to care. Winter descended on Wyoming like a hammer blow, transforming the landscape into a crystalline wasteland of white and gray. The cattle huddled together in the lee of the barns, their breath creating clouds of steam in the frigid air. Ice formed inch-thick on the water troughs each night, requiring the ranch hands to break it with axes each morning. It was the kind of winter that killed the weak and tested the strong, and Eleanor found herself tested in ways she'd never imagined. Thomas came twice a week now, always with legitimate ranch business to discuss. They'd successfully renegotiated the Army contracts at Fort Laramie, the commander treating Eleanor with surprising respect, largely due to Thomas's presence. Together they'd navigated the complex world of cattle prices, grazing rights, and winter feed supplies. He taught her to read the account books with a critical eye, to spot the small discrepancies that could cost thousands over time. But it was the other lessons, the unintended ones, that haunted her quiet hours. The way his hands moved when he explained something, patient and sure. How he'd remove his coat in the warm kitchen and roll up his sleeves, revealing forearms corded with muscle. The slight smile that would touch his lips when she grasped a particularly difficult concept. Pride and something else flickering in his dark eyes. They worked side by side through the bitter January days, mending fences before the worst storms hit, checking on the pregnant cows in the birthing sheds, distributing hay to the far pastures. The ranch hands had grown accustomed to seeing them together, and if any found it improper, they kept their opinions to themselves. Jake Sullivan, in particular, seemed relieved to have Thomas's expertise to rely on. One gray afternoon, they were in the barn repairing harnesses when Thomas suddenly stopped working. His fingers stilled on the leather, and he stared at nothing, that distant look claiming his features again. "What is it?" Eleanor asked, setting down her own work. "Do you know what today is?" His voice was quiet, almost lost in the sound of wind rattling the barn doors. She thought for a moment. January 20th? Clayton's birthday. He would have been 44. The name hung between them like a physical presence. They rarely spoke of him directly anymore, as if by mutual agreement. But he was always there, in the space between them, in the careful distance they maintained. "I didn't know," Eleanor said softly. "He never told me when his birthday was?" Thomas's laugh was short and bitter. "No, he wouldn't have. Clayton didn't believe in celebrations, said they were weakness, sentimentality." He paused, then added more quietly, "Our mother used to make honey cakes for our birthdays, before she died." "How old were you when she passed?" "I was 12. Clayton was 17, old enough to take charge. He thought father was difficult after that. Drank more. Clayton tried to protect me from the worst of it, in his way." Eleanor moved closer, drawn by the pain in his voice. "He loved you, then, despite everything that came later." Love. Thomas tested the word like it was foreign. Clayton's version of love was control. Protection meant making decisions for everyone else. He never could understand that people might want different things than what he'd planned for them. "Is that what happened with Catherine?" Thomas's hands clenched on the harness. "Catherine is the past, but you still love her." He turned to face her then, and the look in his eyes made her heart race. "No, Eleanor, I don't still love Catherine." The barn suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. Eleanor could hear her own heartbeat, could see the pulse jumping in Thomas's throat. They stood frozen, caught between advance and retreat, desire and duty. "We should go back to the house," Eleanor said, but her voice came out breathless, unconvincing. "We should." Thomas agreed, but neither moved. The moment stretched taut between them, a wire about to snap. Then Thomas lifted his hand, slowly, giving her time to step away. She didn't. His fingers brushed her cheek, rough with calluses but infinitely gentle. "Eleanor," he whispered, and her name was a prayer and a curse combined. "I know," she whispered back. "I know we can't, but knowing doesn't stop the wanting." She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch despite herself. "No, it doesn't." His thumb traced the line of her jaw, and she shivered. When she opened her eyes, his face was closer, his intention clear in the darkness of his gaze. One kiss. What harm could one kiss do? They'd already crossed so many lines, blurred so many boundaries. But Thomas dropped his hand and stepped back, breathing hard as if he'd been running. "Forgive me. I shouldn't have—" "Don't apologize," Eleanor said fiercely. "Not for being the only real thing in my life these past months. You're grieving. You're lonely. I'm taking advantage." "You're not." She caught his arm as he turned away. "Thomas, you're not. If anything, I'm the one who looks forward to your visits too much, who finds excuses to keep you here longer, who—" She stopped, appalled at her confession. Thomas gently removed her hand from his arm, but held it for a moment between both of his. "We're walking a dangerous path. Eleanor, the town already whispers. If we're not careful, I told you, I don't care what they say. You will. When they start refusing to do business with you, when the other ranchers won't deal with a woman of questionable reputation, when the bank finds reasons to call in loans." His voice was steady, reasonable, but she could see the effort it cost him. "I won't be the cause of your ruin." "And what about my ruin if you leave?" The words escaped before she could stop them. "What about the slow death of respectability? Alone in that house with nothing but ghosts and ledger books for company? You're stronger than you know. You've learned so much already." "I don't want to be strong." The words exploded from her. "I'm tired of being strong, of being proper, of being the perfect widow. I want—" She stopped, chest heaving. "What do you want, Eleanor?" The question hung between them, heavy with possibility. She could lie, could retreat to safety, or she could speak the truth that had been building in her heart through all these frozen weeks. "I want to feel alive again," she whispered. "When I'm with you, I remember what that's like." Thomas made a sound low in his throat. Pain and longing mixed. You think I don't feel the same? You think I don't lie awake nights, knowing you're just 5 miles away, alone in that bed? You think I don't torture myself with thoughts of what could be if circumstances were different? Then why fight it? Because I loved my brother, despite everything. Because you're his widow. Because there are rules, Eleanor, and breaking them has consequences. Clayton is dead, she said flatly. He's gone, and he's not coming back. How long am I supposed to mourn a man who barely knew I existed when he was alive? Thomas flinched as if she'd struck him. You don't mean that, don't I? Do you know what our marriage was like, Thomas? Do you know how many nights I ate alone because ranch business was more important than dinner with his wife? How many times I tried to talk to him about something, anything beyond cattle prices and weather, only to be met with silence. Tears were flowing now, but she didn't care. I was lonelier married to Clayton than I'd ever been in my life, and now I'm supposed to honor his memory by being lonely forever? Thomas pulled her into his arms then. Propriety be damned. She buried her face against his chest, breathing in the scent of leather and hay and male warmth. His arms were strong around her, one hand stroking her hair as she cried out months of grief and frustration and confused desire. Shh, he murmured against her hair. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. She pulled back enough to look up at him. I'm not asking for forever, Thomas. I'm not asking for promises or declarations. I'm just asking not to be alone anymore. His control finally snapped. His mouth came down on hers, hungry and desperate, and she met him with equal fervor. It was nothing like the dutiful kisses Clayton had given her on their wedding day. This was fire and need and the promise of everything she'd been missing. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. This is madness. Yes, she agreed. It can only end badly. Probably. Eleanor, she placed a finger against his lips. No more words. No more reasons why we shouldn't. Just let me have this moment. Please. He kissed her again, softer this time, with a tenderness that made her ache. When footsteps crunched in the snow outside, they sprang apart like guilty children. Jake Sullivan's voice called out, Mrs. Ward, you in there? Got a problem with one of the yearlings. Coming. Jake, Eleanor called back, proud that her voice barely shook. She looked at Thomas, seeing her own turmoil reflected in his eyes. We should... I know. He straightened his coat, ran a hand through his disheveled hair. I'll go. You talk to Jake. Thomas, I need time to think, he said quietly. We both do. What happens next? We can't take it lightly. She nodded, wrapping her arms around herself as he headed for the door. Just before he opened it, he turned back. Eleanor, whatever happens, whatever we decide, I want you to know that you've brought light back into my life too. After Catherine, after the break with Clayton, I thought I was done with feeling anything real. You changed that. Then he was gone, leaving her standing in the cold barn with hay dust dancing in the afternoon light and the taste of possibility on her lips. Outside, she could hear Jake talking to Thomas, their voices carrying on the wind. Normal conversation about cattle and weather, as if the world hadn't just shifted on its axis. Eleanor pressed her fingers to her lips, still feeling the warmth of his kiss. She was playing with fire, and she knew it, but after months of ice and emptiness, the burn was welcome. Whatever came next, whatever price she had to pay, at least she'd have this moment when she'd chosen feeling over propriety, life over the living death of proper widowhood. The wind picked up outside, sending snow swirling past the barn windows. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, long and mournful. Eleanor squared her shoulders and went out to face Jake Sullivan and whatever crisis awaited. But her heart remained in the barn, in that stolen moment when everything had changed, from his concealed vantage point in the abandoned trapper's cabin. Clayton Ward watched the ranch through his field glasses, the lenses fogged with his breath in the bitter cold. 5 months. 5 months of living like a ghost, of eating cold beans and jerky, of sleeping on a moldy bedroll while winter tried to claw its way through the gaps in the walls. 5 months of watching his life from the outside, like peering through a window at another man's existence. At first, the surveillance had yielded what he'd hoped. Eleanor's genuine grief, her struggles to understand the ranch operations, her loneliness palpable even from a distance. He'd watched her stand at his grave in the small cemetery, had seen her shoulders shake with sobs. The satisfaction of knowing she mourned him had warmed him through those first frozen weeks. But then Thomas had started coming around. Clayton's jaw clenched as he watched his brother's horse pick its way up the snow-covered trail to the ranch house. Twice a week, regular as clockwork, always with some excuse. Ranch business, contracts to review, problems that needed solving. And Eleanor, his Eleanor, always waiting on the porch despite the cold, her face lighting up in a way it never had for him. He'd tried to tell himself it was nothing. Thomas was helping his brother's widow. Nothing more. Family duty. Christian charity. But as the weeks passed, Clayton couldn't deny what his eyes were telling him. The way they stood too close when examining the ledgers by the window. How their hands would brush as they passed papers back and forth, neither pulling away. The lingering looks, the soft smiles, the way Eleanor would laugh at something Thomas said, really laugh, with her head thrown back. Not the polite titter she'd given Clayton. Today was worse. Today. He'd watched them disappear into the barn together, had waited with growing unease as minutes stretched into an hour. When they'd finally emerged, even from this distance he could see the disturbance in their manner, Eleanor's hair disheveled, Thomas's coat askew, both of them standing apart like magnets forced to opposite ends. "Damn you," Clayton muttered, lowering the field glasses. His hands were shaking, and not from cold. "Damn you both." The rage that filled him was volcanic, threatening to send him storming down the mountain to confront them both. But he forced himself to remain still, to think. This was what he'd wanted, wasn't it? To test Eleanor's loyalty? Well, he had his answer now. 5 months. She couldn't even remain faithful to his memory for 5 months before falling into his brother's arms. But underneath the anger was something worse, a creeping realization that perhaps he'd driven her there himself. The memory of their marriage played through his mind like a punishment. All those silent dinners, all those nights he'd chosen the account books over her company. She'd tried so hard in the beginning, planning special meals, wearing her best dresses, attempting to engage him in conversation about books she'd read or thoughts she'd had. And what had he done? Grunted responses, told her he was tired, retreated to his study with a bottle of whiskey and his endless plans for expanding the ranch. He'd treated her like a piece of furniture, necessary for the household but requiring no particular attention once acquired. She was lonely, he said aloud, the words bitter in his mouth. It was Thomas's accusation from years ago about Catherine, thrown back in his face. You made her lonely, and now Thomas is filling that void, as if summoned by his thoughts. He saw movement near the main house. Eleanor emerged, wrapped in the blue wool coat he'd bought her last Christmas. She stood on the porch, watching Thomas's retreating figure, one hand pressed to her lips. Even from here, Clayton could read the longing in her posture, the way she leaned forward as if drawn by invisible strings. The town would crucify her if they knew. A widow carrying on with her brother-in-law before her husband was cold in the ground, or would be, if there was a body to grow cold. The scandal would destroy her. She'd lose everything, respectability, business connections, possibly even the ranch if the bank decided she was too improper to trust with loans. And Thomas, Clayton's hands clenched into fists. His brother, who'd already tried to steal one woman from him, was now moving in on his widow. The betrayal cut deep, reopening wounds he'd thought long scarred over. But worse than the betrayal was the whisper of truth underneath it. Thomas hadn't stolen Catherine. She'd chosen him, just as Eleanor was choosing him now. Clayton spent a sleepless night pacing the cramped cabin, wrestling with his options. He could reveal himself immediately, confront them with their betrayal while the evidence was fresh. The shock alone might kill Eleanor, or drive her fully into Thomas's arms. He could wait, continue watching, gather more evidence of their perfidy. Or he could accept that he'd set this tragedy in motion himself, that his test had been flawed from the beginning because he'd never given Eleanor reason to remain faithful to a ghost when he'd barely been present as a living man. By dawn, he'd made his decision. He would return. But not yet. Not until he was certain of what he wanted to say, of how to handle what he'd discovered, and not until he'd seen how far Eleanor and Thomas would take their attraction. Would they resist, knowing the consequences, or would passion override prudence? The next weeks were torture. He watched Thomas try to stay away, saw him get as far as 3 days before returning, drawn like a moth to flame. He watched Eleanor attempt to maintain proper distance, only to find excuses to touch Thomas's arm, to stand close enough that their shoulders brushed. The tension between them was visible even through field glasses, a wire stretched so tight it hummed in the winter air. Then came the night of the blizzard in early February. Clayton watched Thomas's horse struggle through the mounting snow, reaching the ranch just as the storm hit in earnest. He'd have to stay the night. No man could ride in such weather. Clayton settled in for a long vigil, knowing this would be the test. Alone in the house, isolated by the storm, would they finally surrender to what had been building between them? He couldn't see much through the driving snow, just the warm glow of windows and the occasional shadow passing by. But when the storm cleared 2 days later and Thomas emerged from the barn, not the house, Clayton knew something had shifted. The careful distance they'd maintained was gone, replaced by something rawer, more dangerous. The conversation he overheard the next week, when he'd crept close to the ranch under cover of darkness, confirmed his suspicions. Jake Sullivan and another ranch hand, Pete Morrison, were smoking behind the bunkhouse. "Don't seem right," Pete was saying. "The boss ain't been dead 6 months and she's carrying on with his brother." "You don't know they're carrying on," Jake replied, but his tone lacked conviction. "Got eyes, don't I? Way they look at each other. Way she lights up when he comes around. Mark my words, there'll be a wedding before the year's out, and folks won't stand for it. Maybe folks should mind their own business. She's a good woman, treats us fair, and Thomas Ward's a decent man. Nothing like—" Jake caught himself. "Nothing like Clayton. You can say it. Boss was a hard man, respected him, but can't say as I liked him much. Still, there's proper and there's not, and a widow taking up with her husband's brother ain't proper." Clayton retreated to his cabin, their words echoing in his head. A hard man, respected but not liked. Was that his legacy? Was that what he'd spent 43 years building? He thought of his father, another hard man who'd believed in discipline over affection, in results over relationships. Clayton had sworn he'd be different, but somehow he'd become the same, perhaps worse, because he'd had the example of what not to be and had followed it anyway. The final straw came on a night when the moon was dark and clouds obscured the stars. Clayton had dozed off in his chair, exhausted from another sleepless night. When he woke and raised his field glasses, he saw 2 figures in the barn, visible through the open door. Eleanor and Thomas, standing close, her face tilted up to his. He watched Thomas cup her face in his hands, saw him speak words Clayton couldn't hear but could guess, watched Eleanor nod, tears visible on her cheeks even at this distance. And then Thomas kissed her, not roughly or desperately, but with infinite tenderness, as if she were something precious that might break. It was that tenderness that broke something in Clayton. He'd never kissed Eleanor that way, had never held her as if she were a gift rather than a possession, had never looked at her the way Thomas was looking at her now, as if she were the sun breaking through storm clouds. "You've won, little brother," Clayton whispered to the darkness. "You've won again, or maybe you haven't won so much as I've lost." He set down the field glasses and stared at his hands, rough, calloused, empty. He'd tested Eleanor's love and found it wanting. But what had he expected? Love required tending like any living thing, starved of attention, of affection, of basic human warmth. Was it any wonder it had withered? And was it any wonder she'd turned to the first person who offered what Clayton had withheld? Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow he would return from the dead and face what he'd created. But tonight, he would sit in his self-imposed exile and mourn. Not for his death, which had been a lie, but for the life he'd wasted, the love he'd squandered, and the brother he'd pushed away who was now claiming what Clayton had never truly possessed. The wind howled around the cabin, and somewhere in the darkness, a wolf answered. Clayton Ward sat alone with his regrets, a ghost haunting his own existence, preparing to return to a world that had already moved on without him. The rumors started as whispers, like smoke seeping under doorways, until they filled every corner of the town. Mrs. Hutchins, that self-appointed guardian of morality, had seen Thomas Ward's horse tied outside the widow's house well past decent visiting hours. Mrs. Garrett had noticed how Eleanor no longer wore her mourning veil when she came to town, how she'd traded her black dress for dark gray, still respectful, but not quite proper for a woman widowed less than 6 months. "It's scandalous, Mrs." Hutchins announced to her quilting circle, needle flashing with righteous indignation. "That poor Clayton not even cold in his grave. Well, if he had a grave proper, and his widow carrying on with his own brother, mark my words, there's something unnatural about it." The other women murmured agreement, their needles picking up speed as if they could stitch morality back into the fabric of their community. By the time the quilting circle disbanded, the story had grown. Someone had seen them walking together by moonlight. Another swore she'd glimpsed them through a window, standing improperly close. Eleanor felt the change immediately. Where once she'd received polite nods and sympathetic smiles in town, now she met cold shoulders and averted eyes. Conversations stopped when she entered the general store. The banker, Mr. Donaldson, who had always been cordial, now seemed to find urgent business elsewhere when she approached. "Let them talk," Thomas said when she told him, but she could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands clenched on the reins. They were riding the boundary of the north pasture, checking for winter damage to the fences. It was the kind of work Clayton would have done alone or with his foreman, but Thomas insisted Eleanor learn every aspect of the ranch. "You need to know this land like your own heartbeat," he'd said. "It's your security, your independence." "Easy for you to say," Eleanor replied, guiding her mare around a snowdrift. "You're a man. Your reputation can weather scandal. Mine is all I have." Thomas pulled his horse to a stop, turning to face her. "Is that what this is to you, scandal?" "You know it's not." She met his dark eyes steadily. "But we can't pretend the world doesn't exist. The bank holds notes on the ranch. The merchants extend credit based on respectability as much as assets. If they turn against me, then we'll find other banks, other merchants. With what influence? Your brother was feared and respected. That opened doors. But a scandalous widow? Doors will slam shut, and you know it." Thomas dismounted, coming to help her down from her horse. His hands lingered at her waist, and she let herself lean into him for just a moment, drawing strength from his solid presence. "What do you want me to do, Eleanor? Stay away? Let you face all this alone?" "I don't know," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I don't know what's right anymore. When I'm with you, everything seems clear. But when I'm alone, when I see how people look at me..." He pulled her close, and she buried her face against his chest, breathing in the familiar scent of leather and sage. "We haven't done anything wrong," he murmured against her hair. "Haven't we?" She pulled back to look at him. "You kissed me. Thomas, I wanted you to. I still want..." She stopped, heat flooding her cheeks. "Say it," he urged quietly. "Tell me what you want." "I want to stop pretending," she whispered. "Stop acting like we're just managing ranch business when every time you walk through my door, my heart races. Stop lying awake at night wondering what it would be like if..." "If what?" "If you stayed." The words hung between them in the cold air, visible as their breath. Thomas's control, held so carefully these past weeks, finally shattered. He kissed her deeply, possessively, as if he could pour all his frustrated longing into this one moment. Eleanor responded with equal fervor, her hands tangling in his hair, pulling him closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the world seemed different. A line had been crossed, and there was no going back. "Tonight," Thomas said roughly, "after the hands have gone to bed, I'll come to the house." Eleanor knew she should protest, should remember propriety and reputation and all the reasons this was dangerous. Instead, she nodded, her pulse thundering in her ears. They finished checking the fences in charged silence, every accidental touch sparking like flint on steel. By the time they returned to the ranch, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Eleanor watched Thomas head to the bunkhouse to speak with Jake, then went to the house to wait. Maria had left a cold supper, but Eleanor couldn't eat. She paced the front room, alternating between anticipation and dread. What was she doing? What would Clayton think if he could see her now? 6 months after his death, inviting his brother into their marriage bed? But it had never really been their bed, had it? Clayton had visited her room exactly twice, on their wedding night, perfunctorily, and once more a month later. After that, he'd kept to his own room, claiming he slept better alone. She'd lain in that big bed night after night, wondering what was wrong with her, why her husband preferred his ledgers to her company. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Thomas stood at the door, hat in hand, his expression uncertain. "We don't have to do this. Eleanor, if you've changed your mind," she answered by pulling him inside, into her arms, into a kiss that left no room for doubt. "I haven't changed my mind. I'm tired of being afraid, tired of being alone. Just give me tonight. Tomorrow we can figure out the rest." He swept her up in his arms, carrying her to the bedroom as if she weighed nothing. There was reverence in the way he set her down, in the gentle hands that unpinned her hair, letting it fall in waves around her shoulders. "You're so beautiful," he murmured, wonder in his voice. "I've wanted to tell you that for months, years, if I'm honest. Even when you were Clayton's. I couldn't help but notice." "Thomas," she breathed, and then there were no more words. Later, they lay entwined in the darkness, Eleanor's head on Thomas's chest, listening to his heartbeat. She felt transformed, as if she'd been sleeping for years and had finally awakened. This was what she'd been missing, not just the physical intimacy, but the connection, the feeling of being truly seen and wanted. "What are we going to do?" she asked quietly. Thomas's arms tightened around her. "I don't know, but I'm not giving you up. Eleanor, not now, not after this. The town can go to hell." The vehemence in his voice surprised them both. "I'm sorry, but I've spent too many years letting other people's opinions shape my life. I let Clayton drive me away from Catherine. I let pride keep me isolated on that piece of hardscrabble land. Nursing old wounds, I won't let gossip drive me away from you. They'll say we planned it, that we were involved even before Clayton died. Let them say it. We know the truth." Eleanor traced patterns on his chest, thinking. "We could leave, go somewhere nobody knows us. California, maybe, or Oregon. Is that what you want, to run?" She considered it. Leave the ranch Clayton had built, the land he'd loved more than he'd ever loved her? Start over somewhere new, where the Ward name meant nothing? "No," she admitted. "This is my home now. I've earned my place here with sweat and tears. I won't let narrow-minded busybodies drive me away." Thomas kissed the top of her head. "That's my fierce Eleanor." Clayton never knew what a fighter he'd married. The mention of Clayton cast a shadow over their intimacy. Eleanor pulled away slightly. "Do you think he'd forgive us, if he knew?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "I think," he said carefully, "that Clayton made his choices when he was alive. He chose the ranch over you, chose his pride over reconciliation with me. The dead don't get to dictate how the living find happiness." A sound from outside made them both freeze, hoofbeats approaching the house. Thomas was out of bed in an instant, reaching for his clothes. "Stay here," he whispered, pulling on his pants and grabbing his gun. but Eleanor was already wrapping herself in a robe, her heart pounding. It could be Jake. Maybe something's wrong with the cattle. They crept to the window, peering out into the darkness. A lone rider sat motionless in the yard, his face hidden by the shadow of his hat. Something about the set of his shoulders, the way he held himself in the saddle, sent ice through Eleanor's veins. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "That horse—" Thomas had seen it too, the distinctive white blaze on the black gelding's face, the way it favored its left foreleg slightly, an old injury from a gopher hole 3 years back. It was Clayton's horse, the one he'd supposedly been riding when he died. The rider lifted his head then, moonlight catching his features, and Eleanor's knees nearly buckled, because staring up at their window, very much alive, was her husband. Clayton's voice carried clearly in the still night air, rough with disuse but unmistakable. "Thomas, Eleanor, I think it's time we talked." Eleanor clutched Thomas's arm, her mind reeling. Clayton was alive, had been alive all this time while she'd mourned him, while she'd struggled with the ranch, while she'd fallen into his brother's arms. The implications crashed over her in waves. Her widowhood was a lie. Her growing love for Thomas was adultery. And Clayton had somehow orchestrated all of it. "He faked it," Thomas said, his voice deadly quiet. "The bastard faked his own death." And suddenly, horribly, it all made sense. The body never found, the convenient evidence, Clayton's mysterious behavior in the days before his supposed death. He'd been testing her, and she had failed spectacularly. Or perhaps it was Clayton who had failed, setting a trap that had caught them all. The ghost of her marriage had returned, and with him came a reckoning none of them could avoid. The front room had never felt smaller. Clayton stood near the fireplace, his clothes dusty and worn, his face gaunt from months of hard living. Thomas positioned himself between Clayton and Eleanor, who clutched her robe closed with trembling hands. The mantel clock ticked loudly in the silence, marking seconds that felt like hours. "You're alive," Eleanor finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "All this time, you were alive." Clayton's eyes, cold as winter steel, moved from his brother to his wife. "Disappointed? How could you?" The words burst from her, sharp with betrayal and rage. "I mourned you. I wept at your grave. You took up with my brother before the ground settled on my supposed grave." Clayton interrupted, his voice hard as granite. "So spare me your outrage. Eleanor." Thomas stepped forward, his fists clenched. "You staged your own death to test her? What kind of man does that to his wife? A man who wanted to know if he was loved for himself or his money?" Clayton's laugh was bitter. "I got my answer, didn't I? Though not the one I expected. Tell me, brother, how long did you wait before making your move? A month? 2? You bastard." Thomas's voice was low, dangerous. "You have no right to stand there in judgment. You abandoned her, left her to run a ranch alone, to face the world thinking she was a widow. And for what? Your pride? Your suspicions?" "My suspicions were justified." "Weren't they?" Clayton shot back. "Here you are, in my house, in my bed, with my wife." "I'm not your wife." Eleanor's voice cracked like a whip. Both men turned to stare at her. She stood straighter, lifting her chin despite her disheveled state. "A wife has a husband. A husband doesn't fake his death and disappear for 6 months. Whatever we were, Clayton, ended the moment you decided to test me like I was livestock at auction." Clayton's composure cracked slightly. "You took vows, Eleanor, for better or worse, till death do us part," she finished. "And you died. I buried you, mourned you, even though you'd never given me much reason to. Do you know what our marriage was? Clayton, it was me eating alone while you worked. It was sleeping in a cold bed while you preferred your study. It was trying to make conversation while you grunted over your newspapers. So you turned to Thomas for comfort?" The accusation hung in the air like a drawn blade. "Yes," Eleanor said simply, and her honesty seemed to stun him. I turned to the one person who saw me as more than an ornament or a burden. Thomas taught me the ranch business you never thought I could understand. He talked to me, listened to me, treated me like I had a mind worth engaging, and betted you the first chance he got. Clayton snarled. Thomas moved so fast Clayton barely had time to react. The punch caught him square in the jaw, sending him staggering back against the mantel. Clayton recovered quickly, launching himself at his brother, and suddenly they were brawling like schoolboys, crashing into furniture. Years of resentment exploding in violence. "Stop it!" Eleanor screamed. "Both of you, stop!" But they were beyond hearing, trading blows with the fury of old wounds reopened. Thomas was younger and stronger, but Clayton fought with the desperation of a man who'd lost everything. They crashed into the side table, sending a lamp shattering to the floor. The sound of breaking glass seemed to bring them to their senses. They separated, breathing hard, both bloodied. Clayton wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, staring at the red smear. "Feel better?" he asked mockingly. "Not particularly," Thomas admitted, touching his split lip. "But it's been 20 years coming." 20 years? Clayton laughed humorlessly. "Still holding on to Catherine, are you?" "This isn't about Catherine," Thomas said quietly. "This is about you believing you have the right to control everyone around you. Catherine, me, Eleanor. We're all just chess pieces to you, aren't we? Move us around, test us, punish us when we don't behave according to your plans." Clayton's face darkened. "I offered you a partnership after Father died. You threw it in my face." "You offered me servitude dressed up as partnership. Everything on your terms, your way, under your control." Thomas shook his head. "I wanted to be your brother, Clayton, not your subordinate. And now you want to be my replacement." Clayton's gaze slid to Eleanor. "Is that what this is? You couldn't have Catherine, so you'll take my wife instead." "Stop it," Eleanor interjected. "I'm not a prize to be won or lost. I'm not property to be claimed." She looked at Clayton, really looked at him for perhaps the first time. He appeared older, worn down by months of self-imposed exile. But more than that, he looked like a stranger. Had she ever really known this man she'd married? "Why, Clayton?" she asked softly. "Why did you do it? Was I such a terrible wife that you needed to test me this way?" For the first time since his dramatic return, Clayton's armor seemed to crack. He sank into a chair, suddenly looking every one of his 43 years. "You want to know why?" His voice was rough, exhausted. "Because I heard you laughing with Mrs. Hutchins about never having to worry about money again. Because I saw how you smiled at the banker's son when he tipped his hat. Because I remembered how quickly Catherine forgot me when someone else came calling. So you punished me for another woman's choices?" Eleanor's voice was incredulous. "You destroyed our marriage because of your own fears." "I had to know," Clayton said stubbornly. "I had to know if you loved me or my money." "I tried to love you," the words exploded from Eleanor. "God help me, I tried. But you can't love a stone wall. Clayton, you can't warm yourself at a cold hearth. You gave me nothing, no affection, no companionship, no trust. And then you're surprised I had nothing left to give your ghost?" The room fell silent, except for the crackle of the dying fire. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, promising another storm. "So, what now?" Thomas asked finally. "You've returned from the dead. Clayton, what's your plan? Have Eleanor arrested for adultery? Challenge me to a duel? What satisfies your wounded pride?" Clayton looked between them, seeing clearly what he'd been watching through field glasses for months. The connection, the easy intimacy, the love he'd never bothered to cultivate with Eleanor himself. "The town already whispers about you two," he said finally. "Your reputation is hanging by a thread. Eleanor, when they learn I'm alive, that you've been involved with Thomas while still married, you'll be ruined. No decent person will do business with you. The bank will call in the loans. You'll lose everything. Then I'll lose everything," Eleanor said steadily. It would still be worth it to be free of this mockery of a marriage. Clayton flinched as if she'd struck him. "You'd choose poverty with him over wealth with me?" I'd choose love over loneliness any day, she replied. The question is, what do you choose, Clayton? Will you destroy us all for your pride, or will you finally let go of what you never truly wanted to hold? Thunder crashed overhead, and the first drops of rain began pelting the windows. The storm had arrived, but the tempest inside the house was far from over. Clayton stood slowly, his movements those of an old man. I need time to think, he said. Thomas, get out of my house. Eleanor, he paused, seeming to search for words. We'll speak in the morning. No, Eleanor said firmly. Both men looked at her in surprise. No more orders. Clayton, no more deciding everyone's fate but your own. You want to think? Fine, but you'll do it elsewhere. This is my home now. I've earned it with 6 months of sweat and tears. You can sleep in the bunkhouse or ride back to wherever you've been hiding, but you don't get to waltz in here and start commanding us like nothing's changed. Clayton's face flushed with anger, but Thomas stepped forward, backing Eleanor's play. You heard her. You gave up your rights to this house when you decided to play dead. For a moment, it seemed Clayton might fight. His hand even moved toward his gun, but then his shoulders slumped in defeat. Without another word, he turned and walked out into the storm, leaving Thomas and Eleanor alone in the wreckage of the evening. Eleanor sank onto the sofa, her strength finally giving out. Thomas sat beside her, gathering her into his arms. What have we done? She whispered against his chest. We've lived. He replied simply. We've chosen to live instead of just existing. That's not a sin. Eleanor, whatever Clayton or the town might say. Outside, lightning split the sky, illuminating the yard where Clayton stood in the rain, looking back at the house that had once been his kingdom. In that brief, brilliant flash, Eleanor saw him clearly, a man destroyed by his own schemes, drowning in the storm he'd created. Tomorrow would bring consequences, decisions, perhaps disaster. But tonight, she was held by a man who loved her truly. And for now, that was enough. By noon the next day, the news had spread through the town like wildfire across dry prairie grass. Clayton Ward was alive, the rancher they'd mourned, whose widow they'd whispered about, whose empty grave they'd decorated with flowers, had returned from the dead like some biblical resurrection, though there was nothing holy about the scandal that followed. Mrs. Hutchins nearly fainted in the general store when Jake Sullivan rode in with the news. Alive? She gasped, clutching her chest. But how? We held a funeral. Don't know the how of it, ma'am, Jake said grimly. Only know Mr. Ward showed up at the ranch last night, large as life. And there's more. He stopped, clearly uncomfortable. More, Mrs. Garrett pressed, her eyes glinting with anticipation of fresh gossip. Jake shifted his weight. Maybe it ain't my place to say, but it was too late. Within hours, everyone knew not just that Clayton had returned, but that he'd found Thomas at the ranch in the middle of the night. The implications were clear to even the most charitable minds, and charity was in short supply when it came to scandal. Eleanor faced it head-on, riding into town that afternoon despite Thomas's protests. She needed supplies, but more than that, she needed to confront the storm before it could destroy her completely. She wore her best riding dress, deep burgundy, not black, and kept her head high as she tied her horse outside Hawthorne's general store. The conversation stopped the moment she entered. 5 women stood frozen near the fabric counter, their faces masks of righteous indignation. Mr. Hawthorne himself seemed to shrink behind his counter. Good afternoon, Eleanor said pleasantly, as if the very air wasn't thick with judgment. I need flour, salt, and coffee. Mr. Hawthorne. That is... The shopkeeper glanced nervously at the women. Perhaps you should speak with your husband about that. Mrs. Ward. Which one? The words slipped out before Eleanor could stop them. And Mrs. Hutchins gasped audibly. The shamelessness, she hissed to her companions. To joke about such wickedness. Eleanor turned to face them directly. Is there something you'd like to say to me, Mrs. Hutchins? The older woman drew herself up like a bantam rooster. "Only that decent women have no words for the likes of you, carrying on with your husband's brother while the poor man's body wasn't even cold. Except it turns out there was no body. Was there? Makes one wonder what really happened. Perhaps you and Thomas Ward planned the whole thing." "That's a serious accusation," Eleanor said quietly. "I trust you have proof?" "The proof is in your behavior. Missy, a grieving widow doesn't take up with another man so quickly unless her husband abandoned her?" Eleanor interrupted. "Unless he faked his death and left her to run a ranch alone. Unless she was so starved for basic human kindness that when someone finally offered it, she was grateful enough to accept." The women exchanged glances, clearly not expecting Eleanor to defend herself so boldly. "The law is clear. Mrs. Garrett interjected. "You're a married woman. What you've done with Thomas Ward is adultery, plain and simple." "Then let the law handle it," Eleanor replied. "In the meantime, Mr. Hawthorne, about those supplies." But the shopkeeper shook his head. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Ward, I can't. That is, it wouldn't be proper to extend credit to, under the circumstances." The meaning was clear. She was being cut off, exiled from respectable commerce. Eleanor felt the walls closing in, but refused to show weakness before these vultures. "I see. Then I'll take my business to Carson City. Good day." She left with as much dignity as she could muster, but outside, her hands shook as she untied her horse. The ride back to the ranch felt endless, every passing rider seeming to stare with knowing eyes. She found Clayton in the front room with Thomas, Jake Sullivan standing uncomfortably by the door. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Ah, Eleanor," Clayton said with false pleasantness. "We were just discussing the future of the ranch. Jake here needs to know who he's taking orders from." "From me," Eleanor said firmly. "I've been running this ranch for 6 months, while I was supposedly dead," Clayton countered. "But as you can see, I'm very much alive, which makes me the legal owner of everything here." "Including me?" Eleanor's voice was sharp. "Is that what I am to you? Clayton, property to be reclaimed?" Jake cleared his throat. "Maybe I should go." "Stay," Thomas commanded. "You'll need to hear this, as will the other hands. Clayton may own the paper on this ranch, but he gave up any moral authority when he perpetrated his deception." "Moral authority?" Clayton laughed bitterly. Rich words from the man who bedded his brother's wife. "The man who comforted a grieving widow," Thomas corrected. "The man who helped her keep this ranch running while you played ghost in the hills. Where were you, Clayton? Where did you spend 6 months while Eleanor fought to save everything you'd built?" Clayton's jaw tightened. "That's not your concern." "The hell it isn't. You want to reclaim your life? Then account for your death first. Explain to Jake here, to all of us, why a man would put his wife through that kind of pain." Jake shifted uncomfortably, but his eyes were on Clayton, waiting for an answer. It was clear the ranch hand's loyalty was divided. Clayton had been a hard but fair employer, but Eleanor had earned their respect through months of working alongside them. "I had my reasons," Clayton said stiffly. "He was testing me," Eleanor said flatly. "He wanted to know if I'd married him for love or money, so he faked his death to see how I'd react." Jake's weathered face showed his shock. "That true, Mr. Ward?" Clayton's silence was answer enough. "Lord Almighty," Jake muttered. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but that's about the coldest thing I ever heard." "Get out," Clayton snapped. "You're fired." "You can't fire him," Eleanor protested. "Jake's been invaluable." "I can, and I did. Any man who can't show proper respect to his employer has no place on my ranch." "Then I'll go too," another voice said from the doorway. Pete Morrison stood there, hat in hand. "If Jake goes, I go. Man who'd do what you did ain't a man I care to work for." Within an hour, half the ranch hands had given notice. The ones who remained did so out of desperation for wages, not loyalty. Clayton watched his carefully built empire crumbling with growing fury. "This is your doing," he accused Thomas. "You've turned my own men against me. You did that yourself." Thomas replied, "These men respect honesty. Clayton, they can forgive a lot, but not cruelty disguised as cleverness." That evening, as tensions reached a breaking point, an unexpected visitor arrived. Judge Harrison from Cheyenne, a thin man with sharp eyes behind wire spectacles, appeared at the door with a leather portfolio. "Judge Harrison?" Eleanor said, surprised. "What brings you here?" "A rather unusual legal matter. Mrs. Ward, or should I say, Miss Sinclair." He adjusted his spectacles. "May I come in?" Once seated, with all three of them watching warily, the judge opened his portfolio. "I've been reviewing the circumstances of Mr. Ward's supposed death and subsequent resurrection. There are some interesting legal questions at play." "Such as?" Clayton demanded. "Such as the fact that you were legally declared dead. Mr. Ward. Death certificate filed. Will read. Estate in the process of transfer. Your returning doesn't automatically undo those legal proceedings." "That's absurd. I'm clearly alive." "Indeed. But the law moves slowly and requires proof. There's also the matter of fraud, faking one's death for any purpose, including to test a spouse's fidelity, is illegal in the Wyoming Territory. You could face criminal charges." Clayton paled. "You can't be serious." "Quite serious. Furthermore, there's the question of abandonment. You left your wife for 6 months without support or communication. Under territorial law, that constitutes grounds for divorce." "Divorce?" Eleanor leaned forward. "On what specific grounds?" "Abandonment, as I mentioned. Also mental cruelty. The act of forcing someone to grieve a false death certainly qualifies. And if Mr. Ward pursues any action against you for your friendship with his brother, he opens himself to counterclaims of fraud and deliberate infliction of emotional distress." The room was silent as the implications sank in. Clayton's plan to test Eleanor had backfired spectacularly, tangling him in legal complexities he'd never considered. "What do you recommend, Judge?" Eleanor asked quietly. "I recommend all parties think very carefully about how they wish to proceed. The scandal is already significant. A public legal battle, with all the sordid details exposed, would destroy all three of you. Sometimes, the wisest course is compromise." After the judge left, promising to return in a week for their decision, the three of them sat in heavy silence. The chess game Clayton had initiated had become a stalemate, with no clear winner and potentially devastating losses for all. "We can't go on like this," Eleanor said finally. "The ranch is falling apart. The town has turned against us. Something has to give." Clayton stared into the fire, his profile harsh in the flickering light. For the first time since his return, he looked truly defeated. The man who'd thought himself clever enough to test fate had discovered that fate had tests of its own. "What do you want, Eleanor?" he asked quietly. What would make this right? It was the first time in their marriage he'd ever asked what she wanted. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. "I want to be free," she said simply. "Free to choose my own path, make my own mistakes, love where my heart leads. Can you give me that, Clayton? Or will you drag us all down into ruin for the sake of your pride?" The question hung in the air like the judge's warnings, heavy with possibility and fraught with danger. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows with nature's own judgment on the folly of men who thought they could control the human heart. The week that followed Judge Harrison's visit passed like a slow fever dream. Clayton had taken up residence in his old study, emerging only for terse meals where the three of them sat in suffocating silence. Thomas had moved back to his own ranch but came daily to help with the remaining cattle, working alongside the skeleton crew of hands who'd stayed. On the 7th morning, Clayton appeared at breakfast looking haggard but resolved. He set a document on the table between Eleanor and Thomas. "I've made my decision," he said quietly. "I'll grant you the divorce. Eleanor, uncontested. I'll take responsibility for abandonment." Eleanor's coffee cup rattled against its saucer. "Clayton, let me finish." He held up a hand. "I've also decided to deed you a quarter of the ranch, the eastern section with the best water rights. It's enough to make a good living if managed well. The rest I'll sell and leave Wyoming." Leave? Thomas spoke for the first time. Where will you go? Clayton's smile was rueful. California, perhaps. Or Montana. Somewhere I can start fresh without the ward name following me like a shadow. He looked at his brother. I'm also prepared to sell you the northern pastures at a fair price. I know you've had your eye on that land for years. Why? Eleanor asked. Why now? After everything. Clayton moved to the window, gazing out at the land he'd spent 20 years building. Because I finally understood something. You can't test love. Eleanor, it's not cattle to be weighed or land to be measured. It either exists or it doesn't, and all my schemes couldn't create what was never there. He turned back to them. I was a fool. A proud, suspicious fool who confused possession with affection. I thought if I could prove you loved my money more than me, it would justify my coldness. Instead, I proved that coldness kills love more surely than any betrayal. Clayton, Thomas began, but his brother cut him off. You were right about Catherine. Clayton continued. I didn't lose her to you. I never had her to begin with, just like I never truly had Eleanor. You can't lose what you never bothered to win. Eleanor stood, moving toward him hesitantly. It wasn't all your fault. I could have tried harder. No. Clayton's voice was firm. You tried plenty. I remember now, those first months, all the little gestures I rebuffed, the special dinners I was too busy to attend, the conversations I cut short. You offered your heart, and I locked it away like surplus grain in a warehouse. He pulled another paper from his jacket. I've written to Judge Harrison. He'll handle the divorce proceedings. 6 months from now. You'll be free to marry Thomas if you choose. The town may gossip, but with me gone, the scandal will fade. New scandals always come along. You don't have to leave. Thomas said quietly, This is your home too. Clayton shook his head. No, it stopped being home when I chose suspicion over trust. Maybe in California, I can learn to be a different man. A better one. Over the next days, Clayton worked with characteristic efficiency to dissolve the life he'd built. The main ranch house and eastern pastures would go to Eleanor. Thomas purchased the northern sections, finally able to expand his operation. The rest went to a cattle company from Denver, eager to establish a Wyoming presence. Jake Sullivan and the hands who'd quit were rehired by Eleanor, their loyalty to her proven. The town, shocked by Clayton's public acceptance of fault in the divorce, gradually softened toward Eleanor. A woman wronged by a cruel husband's test was more sympathetic than an adulteress. On Clayton's last morning, as his packed wagons waited in the yard, the three of them stood awkwardly by the gate. The years of pain and misunderstanding hung between them, but so did something else, a kind of weary peace. Take care of her, Clayton said to Thomas, offering his hand. Thomas gripped it firmly. I will. Clayton turned to Eleanor, studying her face as if memorizing it. Be happy, he said simply. Be everything I never let you be. Clayton, Tears coursed down her cheeks. I'm sorry it ended this way. I'm not, he said, surprising them all. Oh, I'm sorry for the pain, the wasted years, the foolish test, but if it hadn't ended this way, we'd have gone on forever in that cold mockery of a marriage. At least now we all have a chance at something real. He climbed onto his wagon, taking the reins. Goodbye, Eleanor, Thomas. He paused, then added with a ghost of his old wry humor, Try not to name your first son after me. That would be awkward. Then he was gone, the wagon disappearing into the morning mist, taking with it the ghost of Clayton Ward, the hard man who'd learned too late that hardness breaks before it bends. 6 months later, on a golden autumn day with aspens shimmering like coins in the breeze, Eleanor married Thomas in a simple ceremony at the ranch. Only a few attended. Jake Sullivan stood as witness. Maria dabbed at her eyes, and the hands who'd become like family gathered in their best clothes. Eleanor wore a cream-colored dress with wild roses in her hair. Thomas waited for her beneath the big cottonwood, his eyes bright with joy and wonder that this day had finally come. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, their kiss held all the promise of spring after a long, brutal winter. The town eventually accepted them. As Clayton had predicted, new scandals arose to occupy wagging tongues. The ranch prospered under their joint management, Thomas's quiet strength complementing Eleanor's fierce determination. They raised 3 children in that house where Eleanor had once wandered like a ghost, 2 boys and a girl, who grew up knowing they were loved, truly and deeply. Years later, they received word that Clayton had made a success in California, building a fruit empire in the Central Valley. He never married again, but his letters, rare but warm, spoke of contentment, of peace found in solitude and honest work. Eleanor kept those letters in the drawer where she'd once hidden her tears. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when Thomas was reading to the children and the fire crackled warmly, she'd touch that drawer and think about the strange paths that lead to happiness, how a man's cruel test had ultimately set them all free, how love, real love, couldn't be measured or weighed but only lived, day by day, choice by choice. The wild Wyoming wind still howled around the house on winter nights, but inside was warmth and laughter and the solid presence of a love that had survived betrayal, scandal, and the ghost of what might have been. In the end, that was the only test that mattered, not whether love could be proven, but whether it could endure and grow when given the chance to flourish in the light. As Eleanor watched her daughter practice her letters at the kitchen table, Thomas's hand warm on her shoulder, she knew the answer. Love was like the prairie grass. It could survive drought and fire and the harshest winter, coming back stronger for the trials. All it needed was room to grow, and someone who understood that the deepest roots were often hidden from view, growing in secret until they were strong enough to weather any storm. The ghost of Clayton Ward had taught them that, in his way, and for that hard lesson, Eleanor was finally, truly grateful. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I'm curious to know where in the world you're enjoying this tale. Please share in the comments below so we can connect across the miles. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and let me know your thoughts about Eleanor, Clayton, and Thomas's journey. Did Clayton's decision surprise you? What would you have done in Eleanor's place? I'd love to hear your perspectives.